14. August 1949. Hereford, British Zone, North Rhine, Westphalia. A seamstress in a rented attic leans on a kitchen table and writes a sentence that could not be spoken in the street. I risked my life once in silence. Today they call me a Democrat because I put a cross in the right box. The table is second-hand. The pencil is army issue. The rationed bread is yesterday's. She signs the letter with her first name only, Margaret. She folds it back into the workbox where thread is wound on cardboard, where chalk and pins lie beside a medal from a dead husband and a faded snapshot of a boy with dark eyes. She did not keep the boy's photograph by accident. 1945 had ended differently than anyone expected it to. In Hereford, British armoured cars rolled past the river, April rain on their hoods, while citizens peered from cellars. The sound of boots changed. Flags changed. The taste of fear did not. Occupation reports from the British military government record the dates, the requisitions, the curfews. The town was taken with little resistance. The rail station was damaged. The gasworks needed repair. In the municipal files, pages from April and May 1945 are streaked and brittle, cold, precise. The streets were grey. Houses were open to the weather like cracked teeth. Everything lay in pieces. The Trümmerfrauen arrived with scarves tied and sleeves rolled, shoveling bricks into neat stacks. The mathematics of rubble was simple and cruel, each wall knocked down into hundreds of fragments, each stair broken into useless slabs. Women with calloused hands moved a city by inches. The missing had no mathematics. Names were chalked onto boards in the square. Elizabeth, Franz, Willie. Letters were sent to army offices and came back undelivered. A boy from the next street returned from a camp with a cough he could not stop. A woman waited by the station twice a day, every day, for a husband never on any list. They organized life by paper. Occupation ordinances declared curfews. No one outside after 8 p.m. Bicycle bells went silent. Windows were dark. Each night, police patrols wrote brief notes of compliance and scattered infractions. The local priest began a ledger of dead and displaced. His handwriting shrank as the pages filled. It is easy to say you would have spoken then. It is easy now. In 1945, citizens sorted their pasts into sentences that made survival. They wrote, "I was not political," on forms and into conversations. They rewrote history at kitchen tables where daughters listened and learned when to keep quiet. Margaret had secrets that did not fit question 7 of the denazification questionnaire. Occupation officers, responsible for a town they did not know, asked the same 40-some questions 100,000 times. Names, dates, memberships, organizations, meetings, money paid, statements signed. Have you ever attended a political rally? Others wrote, "Not that I remember," and passed inspection. She wrote, "Never member," which was true. It was not the truth that mattered most. The boy in the photograph could have been her son. He was not. He had been brought to her in 1944, carried like contraband, hungry and silent. His name was Jakob. He smelled of damp straw and fear. He was 13. He spent 4 months in a cellar where coal dust blackened his hair, and her careful barter fed him on the mathematics of hunger: 1 potato for stitches, 2 cigarettes for a loaf, a dress altered for a spoon of jam to quiet a child who could not cough in the wrong hour. Cold calculations can carry mercy too. The arithmetic of risk is not always heroic. It is work. It is choosing which rumor to believe and which neighbor to trust, and who knows the police chief's cousin and who will betray for butter. It is a thin blanket spread over a winter. He left her in March 1945, led out eastward by a man in an army coat with no insignia. She received no message after. She traced his face in her memory with the same motion she used to mark fabric with chalk. After the surrender, occupation authorities published reports of displaced persons. The words sat heavy in town council minutes. Near Hereford, in Bielefeld and Paderborn, barracks held Poles, Ukrainians, Jews from camps whose names the locals had not spoken until the leaflets fell. Allied intelligence summaries that spring and summer counted them by categories: Jews, Catholics, women, men, children, the mathematics of the living. The British Zone DP situation. The task was management. The speech was of logistics. On the road outside town, a column of survivors in clothing that did not fit and shoes that barely held together walked toward a train. Some stared at the houses. Some did not look up. A few knocked on doors and asked for water. People remembered that part. They do not admit whom they refused. In oral histories recorded decades later, housewives describe how they watched them go past. They recall the silence of those faces. The historian's pen does not capture the taste of shame when you realize what you did not say, what you did not do that morning, and what you had done 3 years before. The mathematics of guilt begins not with numbers, but with names. Union Jacks hung in the town square, and with them a different arithmetic descended. Denazification required everyone to declare themselves. Spushkammer, tribunals in improvised offices with mismatched chairs, listened to oath after oath, read affidavit after Pursleshine, the whitewashing letters from priests and neighbors saying he was a good man, a Mitläufer, a follower. The categories promised clarity that life never gives. Category 1. Major offenders. 2. Offenders. I3. Lesser offenders. IV. Followers. V. Exonerated. In the case of Karl Brenner of Hereford, the Spruce-Kammer file in the Landesarchiv opens with the standard sheet: name, date of birth, occupation, accountant. An ink stamp from 1946. He was a corporal before a bullet shattered his leg on the Eiffel front in November 1944, then a clerk in the town's building office under the caretaker mayor installed by the British. He had joined the party in 1937, like so many men in his office who, he admits in later notes, feared career stagnation more than any politics. Category 4, the tribunal decided. A follower. He paid a fine. He was permitted to keep his employment with conditions. The mathematics of guilt in his case was a ledger of forms, a party card filled in with a blue pen, a signature below a meeting attendance list, testimony from the priest that he had looked away when the brown shirts harassed a Jewish shopkeeper in 1938. Looking away was a currency in those years. The tribunals wanted stability. The British needed administrators to run waterworks and issue ration cards and fix bridges and tally households with usable stoves. Of the thousands who passed through Bielefeld and Detmold's Spruchkammern, only a few hundred in the district went to prison. Smaller numbers never left. Many quietly returned to office desks by 1948. This is a statistic. It is also a choice. It was a cold choice. The hunger winter of 1946-47 cut through all explanations. Rations fell below subsistence. Food was mathematics that season. A body could live on 1,000 calories if it did not move. The women on rubble heaps moved anyway. Children were sent on barter trips, Hamsterfahrten, to farms where relatives might give a sack of potatoes for a watch. Farmers could ask high prices. City folk came with family silver wrapped in newspaper. Cigarettes evened all accounts. Chesterfields. Lucky strikes. A carton equaled a pair of shoes. A single cigarette could buy 4 eggs. Allied garrisons smoked, and the town learned to count differently. It is no wonder the black market thrived. It is no wonder parents looked away when their boys met the men who made a living under bridges and in cellars. Margaret kept her sewing machine going with oil from the bicycle repairman and a promise to mend his wife's coat. Her ration card had the stamp for heavy work, secured by her friend at the Labour office. The records call it fraud. The neighbourhood called it survival. This is not to argue that any choice was an easy one. It is to insist that the arithmetic of those winters was unforgiving. To sew through a frozen morning required both skill and sugar required stories told to bureaucrats with ears for certain phrases. My husband fell at Stalingrad. We were bombed out. We take in a refugee family. Not all were lies. Most were variations on the same mathematics of dignity under conditions that had erased it. Into towns already short of everything came the expulsions. In 1945 and 1946 and 1947, trains brought ethnic Germans pushed or marched from Silesia, East Prussia, the Sudetenland and beyond. The term expellee in reports is clean, efficient. The reality was not. They arrived with lice and coughs, with bundles of bedding, with a few pots. They were assigned to rooms by councils whose records are a geography of resentment. The arithmetic of housing, in a street like Margaretenstrasse in Hereford, added up to more bodies per square metre than any plan could rationalise. 2 rooms and a kitchen. 6 people. Add 4. Recalculate. Take readings on the coal allotment. Recalculate again. Carl, now in the offices that scheduled repairs and assigned cellars to families who had nowhere else to sleep, wrote the numbers in a careful hand. He sometimes looked at the ceiling when those he had to move out of kitchens yelled in front of his desk. Behind his neat ledger he kept a smaller notebook where he listed the names of those he had to evict, not by will but by quota. It was a small defiance of a system that wanted anonymous counts. Later, he said he needed a way to remember that the decisions had weight. The newcomers prayed in different accents. They brought songs and grudges. They told stories of what the Soviets did and what Polish militiamen had said, and what the Czech police had shouted when they banged on doors in May. Their voices settled into the town like wood smoke. The locals had their own stories and were not eager to make room for new ones. There were fights. There were notices posted on boards. Refugees must not take apples from gardens. There was the arithmetic of belonging, measured in parish councils and soccer clubs, and who got hired when the factory reopened. It would be wrong to generalize. It would be wrong not to. The occupation reports described tensions within the local population due to housing allocations. The DPs in nearby camps were bodies on lists. They were also people looking over the fences into towns whose people looked away. In August 1945, British officers drove some townspeople to a nearby former Labour subcamp as part of an education tour. The men and women stood at the edge of a pit and smelled what had been done. Some wept and said prayers. A few shouted that this was propaganda. Years later, in interviews, one woman remembered a British soldier pointing to a pile of shoes and forcing her to look. He said, "This was done in your name." She said she could not look for long. She said she could not sleep that night. She then asked in a whisper if her husband's body had been thrown into Russian pits. Grief does not divide along moral lines, nor does blame. The mathematics of that summer seems cruel to us now. It was. Children played among ruins that winter and the next. They found Egyptian cigarettes dropped by British soldiers. They found paper badges. Some found bones. Their games were counted in the casualty of infection. Tetanus killed a boy 2 houses down from Margaret's. Parents pleaded for penicillin. Paper changed hands faster than bread. Denazification required it. Registers, cards, forms, affidavits. Marshall Plan aid would require paper too. The currency reform of 20 June 1948 required new numbers across registers. Overnight, Reichsmarks turned to Deutschemarks. In that conversion, the black market lost its currency. In that conversion, barter retreated. The mathematics of scarcity could now be translated into wages and prices again. Marshall Plan shipments arrived in the fall. Flour. Machines. Grease. Reports from the Office of Military Government, U.S. Zone, emphasized the need for discipline in distribution. The British zone administrators across the river sent memos to Hereford, "Be ready to receive deliveries." The smell of new pine covered the stench of mold. The mathematical signs changed. Addition replaced subtraction. This was the beginning of something that later would be called a miracle. Wirtschaftswunder. It did not feel like one at first. It felt like a factory bell ringing again. It felt like brown coal dust on collars. It felt like a box of chocolate bars in a child's hand carried home like a treasure. It felt like Margaret's first order for 2 dresses in wool that did not itch. It felt like paper again, but this time on which to write invoices. It is easier to love a ledger than a tribunal. Carl preferred the new accounts to the old interrogations. He was transferred in 1949 to a furniture plant co-op on the edge of town. East Westphalia made cabinets and chairs before the war. After, it made them again with a different clientele. The British NAAFI needed tables. Later, wholesalers in the Ruhr placed orders. There is a photograph in the company archive. Men with hair slickened back standing behind a workbench. A sign in the background reading Sicherheit zuerst. Safety first. In the corner, a stack of forms, order slips and export permits. Paperwork again. The mathematics of growth required it. Reconstruction had its stories too. Stories that did not mention who supplied the planks and who had once marched in a uniform that fit too well. The politics of the new state followed the logic of the ledger. The Basic Law was promulgated on 23 May 1949. It promised dignity that could be defended in court. It promised a system that produced stability. That stability was dependent on quiet, on bargains not written into law, but remembered across desks. No one wanted the communists to gain votes. No one wanted to open too many files. There was the arithmetic of the Cold War. It added different numbers to the equation of guilt, not only what did you do then, but what will you do now? In August 1949, this arithmetic became explicit. The first federal election was scheduled for the 14th. Parties printed cheap posters. The CDUs showed a mother and child, and the words "Keine Experimente" came later, but the sentiment was already present. The SPD had numbers too: pension increases, public housing. The KPD spoke into a wind that wanted not to hear it. The DP, the BHE of expellees, all bid for votes. The mathematic of coalition hung over everything. On the morning of the election, Margaret dressed in her one good blouse and walked to the school where the voting booth stood in a classroom that still smelled of chalk and damp wood. She received the ballot and considered it as if it were a piece of cloth she needed to cut right the first time. She thought of the boy in the cellar. She thought of neighbors who had sat on denazification panels and neighbors who had sat on party committees 10 years earlier. She thought of what the priest had said last Sunday about responsibility. She marked with a cross. She went home and wrote the sentence with which we began. "I risked my life once in silence," she wrote. "Today they call me a Democrat because I put a cross in the right box." She folded the paper and hid it again. She did not speak about the child. She did not speak about the men who had nodded at her door in 1944 and told her the wrong eyes would get him killed. She voted for the CDU. In the same school, Carl stood in line. He had been told by his foreman that the Christian Democrats would protect the business. He trusted Adenauer more than he trusted the SPD. He feared a return of chaos. He voted for the CDU too. On the way out, he nodded to a neighbor he had seen at the Spruchkammer in 1946. They did not speak about 1948 or 1941. They spoke about coal deliveries. They spoke about wages. They both knew the file cabinet hidden behind that conversation. The politics of 1949 depended on men like them agreeing to disagree about the past, but to agree about prices. The early Federal Republic constructed itself on routines, on 1950s commemorations of air raid dead, on ex-belly associations' speeches about a lost homeland in the East, complete with maps showing Silesia and East Prussia as distant but intact in memory, on schoolbooks that spoke of German suffering without pages showing who had suffered in German camps. The mathematics of memory shifted. In a 1952 Westphalian schoolbook, the chapter on recent history lists Versailles, inflation, Hitler, war, flight, and expulsion. Jews is a word that does not appear in the index. In many towns, history was retold around the kitchen table as a lament for bombings and an explanation of fear. This was not all that was spoken. Some priests spoke plainly. Some teachers insisted on names of camps. But the pattern was clear enough that Bundesarchiv collections of textbooks show a nation that taught its children to weep and be wary, not to ask too much about perpetrators. The state encouraged a type of recollection that would not break the fragile coalition of consent. Under pressure from allies and the exigencies of the Cold War, the West German government passed amnesty laws for lesser offenders in 1949 and 1954. The 131 law of 1951 reinstated civil servants who had been dismissed under denazification. Men returned to their desks. Others who had sat far higher in the hierarchy of cruelty were never called to account. The mathematics of justice was approximate and skewed by necessity. The files in state ministries show the names of former party functionaries entering offices under new titles. The Federal Archive notes how many were in position by 1952. The numbers are not surprising if one understands how systems function. States prefer experienced officials. Democracies built by occupation authorities and staffed by neighbors do not sift all that was done. Karl felt this in his bones each time a contract passed his desk with a signature of a man he remembered in a brown uniform, now in a grey suit with a small moustache shaved off. He wrote in his notebook in 1953 a sentence that could not have been spoken without risk of a different kind. We build with the hands available. We pretend not to see the fingerprints. His wife, Elfriede, hung laundry higher on the line in those years. She had less to say about politics than he did. She saved the newspaper clippings about the new furniture line for export to Belgium. Their son played soccer on Saturdays. He learned the names of nations where the company sold chairs. He learned little about why there were new chairs to sell. Margaret continued to measure and cut and stitch. Her shop became a small room at the front of a house with a sign, Schneiderei MH. Women came to have coats mended, to have wedding dresses taken in so they could be worn again by younger sisters. She took the money, put coins in jars for rent and coal, and in the back room she kept the box with the photograph. She had asked at the DP camp near Bielefeld in 1946 if a boy named Jakob, last name Rosenfeld, had passed through. The clerk looked at a ledger and shook her head. The camp closed in 1950. Years later, in an oral history, a staff member recalled a boy who matched his description leaving for Bremen with a group bound for Palestine. The paper trail ends there. The feature of good deeds is that they are not receipts. You can be proud of something no one saw and that no one will ever confirm. Adenauer became chancellor. The BHE joined a coalition. Politics settled into routines of budgets and pledges. The front line moved from battlefields to boardrooms, newspapers and schools. The Federal Republic needed to prove itself within NATO and to its own expellees and to factories rebuilding across the Ruhr. It needed to pay pensions to widows. It needed to pay pensions to widows. It needed to teach children to vote and not to follow. It needed to forget enough to make this possible. The mathematics of forgetting is the arithmetic of selective memory. The terms of the equation are stability, prosperity, and prudence. The variable hidden is guilt. Not all forgot. In households similar to Margaret's, women remembered whispers under a staircase. They remembered boots on the stairs in 1942. They remembered the door handle turning. They remembered a boy in a coal cellar. They did not write letters. Not yet. In houses like Carl's, men remembered bargains made at desks with the British, later with the district commissioner. They remembered hours spent organizing expellees into rooms where they would not fight too publicly and thereby cool down intervention. They did not boast about their wisdom. They did not sleep easily. System building is not heroism. It is a kind of labor. The Cold War offered a different arithmetic of loyalty. In 1956, the Federal Constitutional Court banned the KPD. Public servants signed loyalty declarations. Men like Karl were expected to demonstrate anti-communism as if it were an absolution of earlier loyalties. He complied. He did not consider it hypocritical. He considered it the price of admission to a society that now preferred social peace to rigorous retrospection. He was, as the files say, an example of a democratic renewal. The label fit awkwardly. Labels often do. On weekends, Karl took the train to the big city to see what wealth looked like. In Dusseldorf, shop windows gleamed with products he had never seen before the war. He brought back a lemon for Elfriede and a toy for his son. The exchange rate was favorable now, in arithmetic that had been a joke 10 years earlier. The miracle was in the numbers, GDP rising, unemployment falling. The miracle was also in the silence on Sunday walks. There were cracks in the plaster of memory. Eichmann's capture and trial in 1961 sent a wave through living rooms. He had a name and a face that newspapers printed day after day. The language of bureaucratic murder made forms dangerous again. People who had filled in questionnaires in 1946 felt their pens burn. The Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt 1963 to 1965 forced newsreaders to say the names of guards and the functions of gas and the job titles of men who signed fuel requisitions with a light hand. The mathematics of guilt moved from nouns like Nazism back to verbs. The equations solved for persons. Karl read about the trials in the Frankfurter Allgemeine and put the paper down on the table without comment. His son asked if he had known any of the men whose names appeared in print. No, he said. It was true enough. He did not add that he had known others. He did not know what to do with that knowledge. The trial transcripts available now in the Bundesarchiv list witnesses' recollections, their sentences' recollections. Their sentences run long. They fight with memory to extract detail. Historians know that details are not absolution. They are obligations. Margaret watched the television coverage on a neighbor's set. Her hands held the arm of the chair. She did not cry. She felt a sickness in her stomach like the time 10 years before when the British had brought her and others to see the camp remains in a neighboring district. She wrote a letter in 1964 that she did not send, addressed to the Jewish community of Bielefeld. She asked if anyone knew a jackal with a scar on his left hand. She had never noticed before how many men in the markets had scars on their hands. The 1960s brought a challenge. Students shouted. They asked their fathers what they did in the 1940s. Some shouted too loudly and heard nothing in reply. Some learned. Some left home with questions that could not be answered by the textbooks assigned in the 1950s. The mathematics of generational reckoning used variables no one had yet defined. The cameras pointed at men who had sat in chairs like Karl's and judged them. For some, it was the first time they felt judged. It made them defensive. Democracy does that. to those who prefer order. It demands a reckoning. The reckoning, when it comes, is uneven. There were memorials now to the bombed and the dead of the front. There were also memorials to Jews deported from towns like Hereford. A small plaque appeared in 1967 near the site of a synagogue burned in 1938. The mayor gave a speech. He used careful words. He said, "We." He did not say, "I." Some on the street paused, some did not. A newspaper clipping preserved in a local archive recounts the ceremony. The photograph shows 10 men and 3 women standing in rain with umbrellas. Memory is often a small gathering in bad weather. Margaret continued to work. Her hands stiffened. She kept the box. In 1971, a letter arrived from Israel. The return address was a kibbutz whose name she did not know how to pronounce. The handwriting inside was clean and strong. "My aunt says you hid me," it began. "She says I should write my thanks. I remember a smell of coal and a needle shining." There were no further details. The boy was now a man who had taken another name. He did not ask for anything. The letter, which she put in the box with the photograph, was a receipt that did not total the cost. The story of one rescue can become a story of absolution if told in the wrong tone. It must not be. Margaret kept it. The story of one man's paperwork can become a story of complicity if told in the wrong tone. It must not be unilateral. Carl strove for decency in a context that rewarded caution more than courage. He knew what he had not done. He knew what he had done to ensure families got rooms before tempers exploded. He knew whom he had not pushed out of office and why. He knew he had not pushed out of office and why. He knew he had signed documents that allowed men with stained coats to buy new ones. He knew he had written the first plan for a small housing estate for expellees on a patch of fallow land, and had then watched as those families' children entered the same schools as his son and shouted at each other across schoolyards until they learned each other's names. He knew he had ensured they had running water. He knew what running water felt like when it appeared in a house that had never had it before. He knew that shame and gratitude can occupy adjacent rooms without speaking. He wrote all this down, a little, in a notebook he began in 1950 and added to sporadically until 1972. The notebook is in a drawer now, in a house that has changed hands. Its entries are like occupation reports reduced to one-man scale. March 1952. New building site approved. 24 units. Bricks insufficient. Applied to district for additional 2 wagons. Approved. June 1954. Former NSDAP, Ortsgruppenleiter, now in charge of procurement for a competing firm. Avoided contact. Young men laugh at an old man in a brown coat. No comment. April 1961. Radio reports on trial in Jerusalem. Felt ill. March 1965. New school built. Speeches mention the future. No one mentions the past. Maybe that is fine, maybe not. In 1976, when he was nearly 60, Carl attended the dedication of a bronze tablet in memory of Jews deported from Hereford. He stood behind the crowd. He did not applaud. He did not frown. He stood with hands in pockets and then walked home. His wife said dinner was ready. He turned on the radio. A newsreader's voice recited figures about industrial growth. He thought of the ledger from 1946 listing households and rooms. He closed his eyes. He saw the columns again. He could not convince himself that there had been any other way to add them up. He could not forgive himself for how easily the sum came. He retrieved the notebook from the drawer that night and wrote a sentence. "Some things we have done are not ours alone. Some we own as if they were." He stopped. He added the date. He put down the pen. There is a tendency to want an ending. There is a tendency to want a confession or a declaration of innocence. Neither are earned here. The story of a woman who hid a child is not a parable. It is a piece of a torn fabric. The story of a man who signed forms is not a verdict. It is a record of how a society of imperfect people built a form of democracy out of rubble and ration cards and contradictions. The big words, forgiveness, guilt, justice, are too heavy to hang on such thin nails. The lighter ones, work, fear, hope, hold more weight than they appear. The mathematics of post-war life is addition by fractions. A little courage plus a lot of caution. A sentence unsaid plus a vote cast. A trial in a distant city plus a plaque in rain. A factory shift plus a quiet refusal to shake a hand. A hidden boy plus a letter 20 years late. The arithmetic of the Cold War divided communities into acceptable and unacceptable. The arithmetic of expulsion subtracted millions of people from their homes and added them to towns that had no space. Though hearts made space slowly, sometimes grudgingly, because winter makes even enemies share stoves. The arithmetic of denazification classified guilt and absolved for reasons as much political as moral, and then reversed itself in amnesties as the West German state required continuity in its agencies more than it required visible repentance. The arithmetic of food counted calories, and the arithmetic of housing counted bodies into rooms, and the arithmetic of memory counted bodies into rooms, and the arithmetic of memory counted the dead in bombings and left blank spaces where murdered neighbors should have been. It is possible to write all this without ever mentioning a name. It is also a way of not seeing. In 1982, the furniture plant celebrated an anniversary. Men in suits gave speeches about export successes and new machines. Carl sat at a table in the back with other retirees and held a piece of cake on a paper plate. He listened to a regional politician talk about the values of the region and their importance in rebuilding. The word responsibility appeared 3 times. The word Juden did not. He went home and took out the notebook again. He wrote, "We are good at addition. We are worse at remembering." Margaret died without sending her letter to Bielefeld. Her landlord found the box. He considered opening it. He did not. It passed to a niece, who placed it on a shelf and then opened it 30 years later when an archivist asked for documents of everyday life. The photograph lay on top. A boy with dark eyes and a shadow of coal dust in the corner of his mouth. The archivist wrote a caption, "Unidentified boy, 1944-45. He could not write more. He could not write less. It is tempting to measure the Federal Republic by GDP charts. It is tempting to measure denazification by numbers sentenced versus numbers acquitted. It is tempting to measure expellee integration by census data. These numbers are real. They sit in Bundesarchiv tables like clean proofs. They also miss what the seamstress wrote and what the clerk could not say. Look again at the date on the first page. 14 August 1949. A small town, a woman with a pencil. A sentence written in a hand that shook a little from age and partly from the echo of risk. She did not vote to absolve herself. She did not vote to condemn others. She voted because the ledger of her days had to add up to something a child could live with. She sewed for women who had thrown away their party pins and for women who had never worn any. She did not call herself a hero. Words like that are for plaques, not for people who wait before dawn and boil water for coffee that drowned in barley. She would have laughed if he said it. She would have said that after the first years what mattered were honest hems and warm coats, and seeing that a certain woman with an accent got an extra square of fabric because her daughter would marry in winter. There is an entry in Carl's notebook, undated, what is the worth of a line on a form? On some days, it is a roof over 5 heads. On some days, it is a brick on a chest. He penned a last reflection shortly before he retired for good, and after he had seen the first generation of his family go to university, an option that would have seemed science fiction in 1946. We have lived by silence, but not only by it, we have also lived by agreeing to procedures. He underlined the last word twice. Procedures saved lives and permitted others to remain lost in files. There is a logic to states. There is a logic to habits. There is a logic to guilt that is not reducible to columns of numbers.